Food is a cultural icon in Singapore, and in fact, there are many, many different kinds of cultural icons represented as food in Singapore. And it's interesting because it's a mixture of both tradition and modernity and what they would call as, French nouveau cuisine that's appeared on the streets of Singapore. So let me talk a little bit about how this happens. So Singapore has excellent restaurants of different grades, different styles, and different kinds of cooking. And I've always had a passion for food. So I went on this discovery journey of food in Singapore, in order to learn the culture. So first I started with, going to the various markets around the various HDB estates. These are hawker centers that have an interesting mix of Indian food, Malay food, Chinese food, and what they call the Western stall, which sells things like chicken chop and fried fish, very iconic Singaporean food dishes that have a blend of many cultures from around the world. For example, the British fish and chips, what it has become in the Singapore context. You may find that fish and chips sometimes may come with ketchup or it may come with sambal. Just shows you how beautifully things are blended here in so many ways. And then, of course, you can get very traditional Indian food like, the dosa in southern Indian shops, combined with more of a syncretic nasi lemak, in an Indian shop. And of course, the Malay food stalls have fabulous food from Malaysia and Indonesia. So it really got me thinking, what is this all about? And then the iconic chicken rice, right? So I said, okay, where does chicken rice actually come from? And I realized it's such a passion amongst Singaporeans to go looking for the best place of chicken rice that you can actually find. And this I hear from a lot of the local people who grew up here, that chicken rice is something that is very Singaporean, and it was created here in Singapore. You may not find something similar in other Southeast Asian countries or even China for that matter. So starting from my walks around hawker centers in and around HDB flats, which was of course very interesting. I learned so much about the local culture here and how people blend in and they try different things on different days. Well, the traditional hawker centers are going through a very interesting transformation. One is, of course, a lot of them are being rebuilt to look nicer and to have better amenities in the hawker center. At the same time, they're also adapting more of a nouveau style of cuisine. Like you will see the entrance of, pizzas and pasta coming into these traditional hawker centers. But at the same time, I noticed that Singaporeans have a passion to find traditional food. So they will want to go and look for that particular brand of chicken rice, or a particular brand of soya milk that somebody used to make perhaps 20 years ago, or a bak kut teh or a char kway teow, all the local favorites. So traditional food is certainly here to stay. I think it's going to continue to stay here, but it's also going through its own reinvention and adaptation. And interesting thing is that in hawker centers, people will often go and they want to try a food from a particular culture. So that's also where you see a lot of multiculturalism happening. Like you may find people of different cultures, of course, trying different things because a particular stall is famous for that. For example, if stall A is very famous for chili crab, right? You find people of all different cultures and wherever they're from, they would want to go for chili crab because that's a very Singaporean dish. Just like, mee siam is a very Singaporean dish as well. So people will go looking for that. Singaporeans have a very interesting concept of dinner versus supper. And it's sort of like two meals in the night. It may not just be one meal. So one of the meals could be much later at night, whereby, you go driving around looking for hawker centers that are open very late. I then moved on to food courts, looking at how food courts have changed over the last 12 and a half years that I've been here. And you can see how various styles have been adapted. For example, food courts have now become extremely stylish. they don't just serve the traditional fare, but you find a lot of interest in sort of molecular gastronomy. You may find sort of a nitrogen infused cafe or something that does a selfie coffee. So I find that food has also become a product of modernization in Singapore. You can, of course, go for the traditional fare, but at the same time, you can move on to have sort of a very modern, almost out of this world experience at the various cafes that appear in Singapore. So normally every weekend, I take like a food walk of Singapore and I kind of note down, hoping that one day I'm going to write some kind of a blog. I will focus now a little bit on one particular area that I've been going to since the past 6 weeks in a row, and that is the Kampong Glam area, in and around, Arab Street, the Bugis, Kalang, Jalan Suntan, those areas. Trying to see, okay, what kind of cultural mixes can I find here within this area? And I've discovered anything from, falafel, different kinds of falafel from various places in the Middle East, which I thought was very interesting. That all this has suddenly appeared, from Turkey, from Egypt, and then there's versions from Iran and so on and so forth, all very nicely coexisting, for the palate. And then you also find Indonesian Malay food that is presented to the tourists. So when the tourist walks into Kampong Glam, they probably find lots of different foods from the Middle East and in Southeast Asia that could probably be classified under halal cuisine, and then they can experience a lot of globalization in that one sitting. So one day I went through this neighborhood and I think went to about 5 restaurants till I was very, very full, because I just wanted to see, okay, what's the difference between, say, something from Egypt versus something from Turkey. Of course, I know that from reading cookbooks from these countries and even trying their cuisines outside of Singapore, but it was interesting to see how they're placed within the Singapore multicultural context. So I realized that the concept of chili becomes very important in Singapore because Singaporeans love spicy food. So what is the thread, between all these different kinds of cuisines from the Middle East, which aren't typically very spicy? Like Egyptian food, for example, is not very spicy. Iranian food is not very spicy. But within the local context, of course, the chili is a thread that kind of combines all these different cuisines and links one culture to another culture here. So that's been a very exciting thing. So I've now kind of narrowed down my experiments with food in Singapore in trying to discover what kinds of chili sauces go with which kinds of cuisine that exist here. And I realized that itself, tells a whole big story about this. So eventually I'd love to produce a blog, the cultural conception of chili sauce in Singapore and what that means in different parts of town. So I've been doing this in Kampong Glam, in the Arab Street area, where, you have anything from House of Biryani, which is a fabulous restaurant, that combines different biryanis from different parts of the Middle East, to say more cafe style Middle Eastern restaurants, to more salad bars and things that are popping up in that area. And then of course the next one I will move on to is probably City Hall, and look at the bigger malls and see how multiculturalism is expressed through food in the malls, and see, just like I found chili sauce to be the underlying theme, if I can find other underlying themes. For example, the next one I'm going to do is the underlining Korean and Japanese theme in contemporary Singaporean cuisine, and how that speaks of globalization in Singapore.